the R.M.Williams Outback podcast, bringing to life the characters that feature in Outback magazine and more.
Hello and welcome back. This is Terry Cowley and my guest on this episode is Peter Kenyon, a big-hearted individual who has a passion for rural Australia, especially small towns. He works with communities both here and overseas to empower them to make transformative positive changes. Peter features in the major story of issue 166 of Outback on small town rejuvenation. This episode is longer than usual. Peter had so many useful and inspiring words to share. If you know of a small town that needs a boost, make sure you tell its people to listen in for some real words of wisdom. Peter Kenyon is known as the guru of small towns. He came into Outback's orbit at the second National Small Town Reinvention Conference in Kapunda, South Australia last year, a gathering organised by his organisation, the Bank of Ideas, the acronym IDEAS standing for Initiatives for the Development of Enterprising Action and Strategies. Peter has worked with more than 2,000 communities in Australia and 60 other countries, helping them come up with fresh and creative ideas to stimulate economic and community renewal. Hello, Peter, and welcome to the podcast.
Terry, great to be here.
Peter, you have received many accolades, not the least being an OAM. You've been described as a community enthusiast and social entrepreneur. Is that how you describe yourself?
Much prefer that than being called a guru. I certainly don't see myself that way. I'm very much a social capitalist and a community enthusiast. I believe passionately in this thing called community and passionate in this thing about social connection, getting people connected to do good things in community. And certainly my love and passion is small town Australia.
Now, this is a big question, but I'll ask it anyway. What is behind your motivation to help communities?
I think I've just always loved the sense of community. I was conceived and born in rural Australia. I've spent most of my time living and working in small towns. And I particularly, to me, after family, probably after my faith, comes this thing called community. I just love the concept of community. I don't think we talk enough about it. I don't think we believe enough in it. To me, whatever the issue, whether it be poverty, whether it be unemployment, whether it be loneliness, whether it be mental health, it's not the latest government program, it's community that's the answer. And so I'm really on a campaign to remind people that we've got this powerful concept called community and people coming together and often initiated with the oldest tool we have in building community. It's called conversation, getting people beginning to reflect on what is it we can do in terms of dealing with not just issues and needs, but also the incredible opportunities we have to kind of like build our communities as places where families and businesses can actually thrive.
Tell me about the Bank of Ideas.
Well, I had a background as a teacher in rural Australia. I then was a youth education officer working on school-to-work transition. And for almost a decade, I headed employment services in Western Australia, but increasingly became disillusioned with this thought that we can somehow create change by a top-down outside approach. I increasingly realised the only way that we're going to reinvent and dealing with issues like unemployment was from within. And so I was really passionate about more and more in terms of how do we actually engage with communities and above all create the space of and by the community to begin to bring about change within those communities. And I suppose I was lucky. I was the youngest director, I think, in their public sector at the time in WA, and I made the decision to leave and create what I call an inside-out approach to kind of like dealing with community opportunities and needs. And we created then what was called IDEAS. And as you said, the acronym, Initiatives for the Development of Enterprising Action and Strategies. It wasn't until I moved to the small town of York, where we had a farm and a historic B&B complex that we were working and living in, that I bought an old bank in the main street of the town. When I was signing the documents, probably one of the greatest insights came from that real estate agent. Phil Mulcahy was his name, and he turned to me and said, "Peter, you now own a bank. Why don't you call yourself the Bank of Ideas?" I think it was one of the greatest ideas. We've certainly have benefited greatly from that name. It often gets lots of reaction, positive reaction from people. So that's where it came from, the small town of York in the wheat belt of Western Australia.
So you did just touch on this then, but helping communities spark their own ideas seems to be an absolutely central part of how you operate.
Without a doubt. I mean, if I look at many of our small towns, and the vast majority of them are dying, when you look at population, when you look at business life, when you look at the ageing factor in these towns. And to me, one of the most critical issues is simply many of these towns are sitting there waiting for the cavalry to turn up from either Canberra or Perth or Melbourne or Sydney or whatever. I'm one that's saying, listen, stop waiting for the cavalry. If you want to see change, you want to see meaningful change in your community and dealing with issues that matter, whether it be youth employment, whether it be lifestyle, whether it be services, whether it be creating an environment where people can age in that town rather than moving to the coast or the city, you can actually do it. And you need to be in charge. You need to take the initiative. And so to me, that's the starting point for change, is realising, A, the cavalry ain't coming. If anything, they're going to continue to deliver less and less often out in these areas. What you've got to recognise is that we, in all of our communities, are incredibly asset rich. Let's start with what we have got, not necessarily what we haven't got, and begin to then look at what is it that we can do together in this thing called community to bring about change, both social and economic change. And I suppose that's very much been the crusade I've been on for at least the last 35 years.
Do you think farmers and agriculture have a special role to play in all of this?
Oh, without a doubt. Agriculture will always be essential and always be a fundamental factor. And farmers, I always admire as probably some of the most entrepreneurial people generally that I know. They take a lot of risk. Just the way that many farmers are adapting is kind of like the type of role modelling we need within our community. What I often find, though, is people are incredibly entrepreneurial and very risk and lack risk aversion when it comes often to their own properties. When it comes to this thing called the town, the community, sadly, many of them tend to opt for a more conservative and more a risk-aversive type position. I'm trying to get them to realise sometimes if you don't take some risk, you're not going to see any change. And to me, if nothing changes, nothing is changing. And we need to often in some of our small towns be a lot more creative, a lot more risk aversive, and certainly begin to look a little bit deeper and more creative at the assets and the resources that we got. It may be the stories. I'm currently doing the action plan for a little town called Bopple in Queensland. Well, Bopple's famous because it's where the macadamia nut comes from. That's where the Bopple nut originated. It's got this amazing Aboriginal legend attached to it, and then that nut, which is in fact the only native product that we actually export, is the macadamia nut. Here's a town that's got that. How do you use that to begin to attract more visitation into the town, and how do we actually create a range of product around that in what we can actually do? And I suppose that's just a very simple example. How do we take the stories attached? There's an amazing Aboriginal legend attached. The way that the nut actually went from there and became, international in a place like Hawaii, just pumps out huge amounts of macadamia. The original macadamia nuts are from Mount Bopple and from this particular place. And again, often it's just something as simple as the story. Often it's the stuff about where people come. I was in Northampton recently. I love driving down the main street, and there are these wonderful, huge cutouts of all of the famous AFL players that came from Northampton. This town has bred more AFL players than anyone, and to see people doing their selfies around their favourite AFL player, to me, was just amazing to see people kind of like, but again, it is an incredible asset they've got. How do they just build upon it? They've done that incredibly incredibly well. And wherever I go, I find amazing examples of creativity happening across the country.
You've talked a lot about sustainability, and I guess that could be applied in terms of how to sustain some of these initiatives, but it's also about being environmentally sustainable, I think.
Without a doubt. And again, you look at a place like Boppal, which again, amazing natural environment there, Mount Boppal and the forests, and how do you preserve that and the wildlife and everything that goes with it? Again, obviously many people have moved to places like that because that's the appeal, is creating that. I live in a stunning place, Kalamunda, which literally means in local Noongar, home in the forest. Well, to me, that's why we've moved here. And again, it's interesting to see, many of us concerned about tree policies now and the loss of tree coverage. And in many ways, we're killing the chook that laid the golden egg. One of the major motivations why people want to actually enjoy this environment, we created that term tree change. Well, that's simply behind it. But to me, sustainability isn't just an environmental thing. It particularly is also a people and leadership issue as much as anything. And one of my greatest concerns is that certainly many of our communities are not sustainable when we look at issues like the level of community engagement, volunteerism, and local leadership. In those areas, we're seeing massive decline. I mean, here in Australia, we've probably got about 1.5 million less volunteers than we had 5 years ago, according to our census figures. 1 in 7 people actively volunteer now. Much better in the bush than it is in the city, but we are seeing in all of our communities, there's not a community I work with without that issue of how do we just get more people interested, involved, putting up the hand, joining us. And sadly, volunteer burnout is a massive issue in many of our towns. And again, how do we build that leadership? How do we also engage young people and not keep seeing him as this so-called leader of tomorrow type stuff? We begin to engage. What are those things we could be doing in our small country school that gets kids thinking about active citizenship, thinking about and dreaming about change they could bring about within their community that they themselves could start to activate? And so one of the programs we have is an amazing little initiative called Are You Mad? And it stands for Are You Making a Difference? And again, just getting kids to think about what do you really care about? Because that's the key question I ask everyone in community. What do you care about? And who else cares about that? And how together we might start doing things. So a lot of our methodologies we work with in trying to activate community is about trying to instigate conversation around some very simple questions. And without doubt, as I said, the most important question you can ask anyone is, what do you care about? Once you know that, you're halfway to engaging them, because if you can actually engage people around what they care about, they're not likely to say no. And so to me, that's a vital part of what we are really trying to do, is to stimulate that type of discovery through conversation.
You've mentioned a couple of different communities, Boppal being one of them. Can you tell me about some of the other communities you've been working with recently or even in the past? Just some great examples of that small town reinvention.
Look, I could choose great examples from every state, and also we do a lot of work in Canada. In fact, I've just had a link up with Canada. I'm going back to Canada to work in the prairies for 3 weeks, which I do annually, and we were just this morning in a link up with some of the Canadians I work with, just reminiscing about some of the incredible changes happening in some of their small towns, particularly in places like Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and the similarities with Australia. We were talking about solo art and how that's taken off in revitalising many Australian towns, and yet something that hasn't quite caught on yet in Canada, and yet they would probably have more silos in their prairie towns than we have. But, probably there are 2 great little towns I love to quote here in Western Australia. One is the town of Coolin, which I've often claimed is probably the most enduring, sustainable and best example of long-term rural reinvention that I know in the country. I can remember it was 30-odd years ago at a cold little night, 60-odd people gathering, and basically drew a line in the sand. They had just lost their bank. They were losing services. There were lots of empty shops. They were down to about 280 people. And that night, I think the decision, do we actually draw a line in the sand and do something, or do we just fade into oblivion? And that night they took on creating a around a mission statement that simply said, we want a town that's no longer a dot on the map and one in which people have a great sense of pride. And they worked on those two aspects. And over the last 30 years, they've just had initiative after initiative that has actually built that community into one of the most sustainable and attractive communities. I think last year more babies were born per population in Coolum than anywhere else in Australia, simply because of the way they've attracted that critical age group, that 28 to 40-year-old and particularly female member into their town. How they did it, they reintroduced their amazing Coolum bush races. A farmer donated a spectacular location, didn't he? Actually leased it $1 for 100 years. That's what I call community giving. And then last year, for example, I think a maximum number of 4,000, now the health department allow them to come to their famous bush races, which is 3 hours out of Perth. They sold tickets out, I think, in 28 seconds when they went on the internet. An amazing weekend that just boosts so much in 300 volunteers. It generates, literally over $1 million into the local economy. That's just one. A group of farmers stupidly asked their young people, what do you think would make a difference? And they said a water slide. And so when the farmer said, well, if we're silly enough to ask, maybe we need to look at it, and checked out, and he found a small town in Australia wanting to get rid of its water slide. Just happened to be on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, 3,000 k's away. They wanted $25,000. Community had that. 6 farmers drove 6 trucks across, dismantled it, brought it back, a 6,000-kilometre journey, and today the biggest water slide outside of Perth in WA. Guess where almost every family in our hot summers kind of like hang out on weekends it's become. And with it, they've done a Ninja Warrior course. They put in a great pump track. They've really become a great family and particularly teenage destination. They were the first town to have a community bank in Western Australia. I could go on and on. The other town today that I think is leading is Noangarup down there in the south. And I can remember again a bit of a crisis meeting, and I asked them, what's your asset? And they're all looking at me. I said, look out of the window. And there is this magnificent Stirlings. They happen to be on an alternative route to Albany through the Stirlings. And so they have started to build up. They've built this amazing high-powered highway using old tractors. They formed a co-op and raised money, I think over $600,000 to start buying up parts of the empty main street. They bought the supermarket, turned it into one of the best IGAs, and then on-sold that. They've currently bought the pub and are reopening that in a really amazing way. Again, how's it all happen in all these towns? Well, fundamentally, 2 things stand out. One's called local leadership, where people are prepared to step up and take on that role. And in both those towns, they've got some amazing local leaders. And secondly, mindset. What they focused on is what they have got, not what they haven't got. And that determination, we can, rather than we can't, kind of like make change. And I suppose this combination of leadership and positive mindset can drive anything. And they are just 2 of, I could quote you hundreds of small towns that have really brought about amazing change through people power, but through people believing, yes, they do want to have a positive future, and B, they can make it happen.
Can you pick out sort of maybe one from each state or one from a couple of states?
You look up in Queensland, out there in Western Queensland, you look at Winton, for example. I just love the way David there at the Dinosaur Centre and turned that into an amazing attraction. I think he went on to become the local hero of Australia through that. What an amazing initiative. But Winton itself is just full of it. Have a look at their town entrance statements. I've never seen a town that promotes its entrances 20 k's out so effectively, systematically. I'm trying to get every town to say, signage matters. You've got to create interest way out. People don't make up their mind if they're going to stop in the town once they drive to the boundary. Winton's a great example of that. And then there's a whole heap of other things I could quote about Winton as a wonderful example. If you go into a place like Victoria, for example, Oyen, famous because that's where the vanilla slice competition, I think, started when Jeff Kennedy had to come up with something because rural people complaining he was so city-fied and mentioned that, but the town took on that. But recently, have a look what the community have done to create the most spectacular lake as a lifestyle option. Again, all community-driven in the sense of creating this amazing water space that now is attracting both residents because of the lifestyle options around it, but also the visitors. That, again, to me is a wonderful example. The town of Donald out there in the Wimmera, always, again, over 40 years under the leadership of Pickles, who runs the menswear store in the town. I mean, they have just been an amazing example of change that can actually happen in the town. Some of those towns in the goldfields, if you go into South Australia, again, wonderful examples. Kimber, for example, where a group of women took an old garage and have turned it into this amazing retail workspace area that just has become a popular destination as people cross over there to the Nullarbor. When I look at some of those amazing towns in the Barossa and the Adelaide Hills, again, I can quote example after example. Where we just had in Kapunda, their latest initiative with their solo art and how they've rallied the community around a spectacular public art kind of like initiative again to just be more than a dot on the map. The little town of William Creek, I've got to mention William Creek as probably the last example, as a great example. William Creek, the smallest town literally in Australia, population 7. But we did have 14 at the community meeting there, I think because we were offering free beer, I think. But we ended up that night having the most amazing conversation, and to see the action plan of that tiny community up there in central South Australia on the Unadilla track and what they are putting in place. They're just really building currently a rage cage as a major teenage kind of like attraction in the town, looking at the way they improve their flying doctor service, the way that they're strengthening the couple and the few little businesses they got, and to becoming more of that visitor kind of like place where you just want to be. Again, it's worth going on the website just to look at their action plan. What a community, literally of 7 with the surrounding pastoralists have been able to create in William Creek is just an amazing example. And so I can go to the town of Paterson in New South Wales. I mean, this group called the Paterson Community Builders, the way over the last 18 months they've reinvented Paterson. Again, one of the best examples of people power that I can quote as a relevant today example. And so Tasmania, again, you just need to drive down between Launceston and out of Launceston. Some of the towns there, Deloraine, for example, a long-term small town that's just kicked goals over the last 40 years. It's been absolutely amazing. I love the fact that all got started when a group of farmers and the hippies that were moving in those 70s kind of like conflicted, but realised one thing they shared in common was the love of art, and they've created the biggest outdoor annual art gallery kind of like thing as just one of those initiatives. But again, Deloraine is just a great example of what a town consistently has done over a long period of time.
You're also an accomplished author, having written 16 books on community and economic development, youth policy and enterprise. Can you tell me a little bit more about the youth component of that? I mean, you've already talked about seeing young people not as the leaders of tomorrow, but, the leaders of now. Can you just expand a little bit on that and how we can encourage our young people to think more civically?
When I went through uni, I worked part-time as a youth worker. I was involved from the age of 12 running a youth club in my local church. So I've always had a passion about being engaged in terms of young people. And certainly I then had 6 wonderful years as a youth education officer setting up school-to-work initiatives in between school and community and as part of young people's pathways. So that was my background. I spent a couple of years at university. I set up youth work courses in Western Australia. So I've always had this strong commitment. And then when I headed the employment services, young people were, again, a critical issue in terms of unemployment. We've got to stop doing things to and for people. We've got to start creating what I call with people, and above all, creating the space of and by the people. And again, young people bring amazing assets to it. I can remember one of the programs that we initiated when I was the employment. I went on a Churchill scholarship, and I saw this thing in Ireland called the New Enterprise Scheme, where unemployed people could convert their unemployment benefit into an allowance to help them set up a business and not have to be work ready and whatever. And we were already doing a lot of youth enterprise stuff, and I came back and I convinced the feds to join with us as the State Department and create what then was called the New Enterprise Incentive Scheme. It's the longest running employment program still in Australian history, and over 300,000 businesses have been created, many of them by young people. So, if you know Eskimo Joe, for example, the band out of Freo, that was a new enterprise. The very first one that I remember, we had this brilliant idea of linking young people with a mentor and community around their interest area. And this young person came up with this amazing tourist idea, camels on Broome Beach. And we linked him to Kevin Turtle. Still remember the name. We're talking 35 years ago, but he was the state manager of Ansett Airlines. He was able to link that young person into the tourism sector like no one could. And we look where that's gone. Well, that was a young unemployed person with an idea. And so to me, always engage young people. They have new perspectives. They have energy. Of all groups, I love working with 6 to 9-year-olds. They just believe they can change the world. They no risk aversion at all. They dream. And again, I love running sessions in primary schools with young people, getting them, firstly, always reflect on what do you love about this community we want to keep. Change is not about always new. It's about making sure we don't lose what makes our community special. But then what is it would change, and what is it that's missing that would actually add value? And although I run lots of, community meetings, often the most creative stuff comes out there. And to me, I think it's just vital that young people are doing it. I think the other thing that I really in many ways despair about is that we do have a lot of wonderful youth leadership development experiences that towns just don't tap into. Rotary run this amazing thing in every state called RYLA, Rotary Youth Leadership Award. It's a 7-day personal development. I did it when I was kind of like 21. I still reflect on it as the best leadership experience in my life, and it's still operating. But how few towns kind of like look at that as a resource, saying, you know what, we've got to make sure we nominate a young person. We as a group have identified over 30 of those youth development leadership experiences that operate regionally, state and nationally, and even internationally. And yet so few communities are not even seeing that as an opportunity. Send one of your young people on a RYLA a week, they'll come back different. They'll come back wanting to kind of like make a difference and get engaged in the community. So, this stuff is not rocket science stuff. This is not kind of like stuff that's costing millions of dollars. This stuff is about thinking different and using a whole pile of assets we already got.
In our story about small towns in issue 166 of Outback magazine, written by my colleague Ken Eastwood, by the way, you say that your DNA is in remote Australia and that you'll always love rural and remote Australia. You did mention Marble Bar earlier. Can you tell me a little bit about your earlier life and how you think that has contributed to leading you where you are today, Peter?
Yeah, look, my mother was the nurse in Marble Bar. My father was a gold miner there back in the early 50s, and that's where I was conceived. My mother, we moved away before the birth, and I was born out of the town, but I always say the red earth is from Marble Bar, and that's where I was conceived. That's where I think my DNA came from. And certainly both my father and my mother, although they separated and I was raised as a single child with my mother, I'm sure the DNA of both of them have flowed through. My father went on to be quite a famous entrepreneur in Australia. But my mother was an amazing woman, and when she retired, she was a matron of 4 hospitals. She taught me to be entrepreneurial. So there's that family DNA, but I think what I've always had is this passion about small towns. And so, my first working job was in Denmark. I was the sports master at the Ag College there. I had a property in a place called Baling Up, which I'll be driving through tomorrow on my way down to work in the south. I spent 15 wonderful years in and out of that particular community, which again is one of the great small towns of Australia. I mean, I don't think there's a better progress association anywhere than the Baling Up Progress Association and what they've actually are doing. And then I had the privilege of living in York for about 12 years. We had a property there. I now live in Kalamunda, and I spend a lot of my time in a place called Pickering Brook, which is literally only 20 minutes from Perth International Airport, but this stunning town with a wonderful heritage of timber. It's where all the railway sleepers that kept the colony of Western Australia afloat before they discovered gold, that became the sleepers for the South African, the London Underground, the Indian railway systems, all came from there. But since around just before and after the war, it was settled by a lot of Italian immigrants who introduced and developed the fruit industry there. Again, a wonderful small town that I just love being associated and involved with. I will always be a small towns boy and never get out of my system. I believe it offers a quality of life that we just do not and cannot ever hope to achieve within today's modern suburbia. A sense of connection, a sense of story, a sense of heritage that to me is just amazing. And also a place that, today really still is the economic lifeblood. If we take farming and take mining and take really tourism, rural tourism out of the perspective, we're not left with too much of what really is the vibrant economic drivers of this country. So to me, I do value greatly the DNA that actually runs through my veins from both a family and from a small town. And so to go back to Marble Bar and the ironclad pub in Marble Bar, to me, is always just a wonderful, wonderful kind of like memory of really where I came from.
You also said in the story, you don't get a second chance at first impressions. And let me tell you, we have some pretty ugly small towns. We all know there are some beautiful towns, but of course we know what I quoted you as just saying then to be true. And you also said, without doubt, towns are going to disappear, and that there are 600 ghost towns in Western Australia. You've mentioned so many positive attributes of those towns that are doing well. What do you see in those towns that aren't doing well? What's missing?
I love kind of like getting communities looking at their towns with fresh eyes. I collect old historic postcards from the 1900s of a lot of Australian main streets, and just to show them often what that main street looked like then, but to also show them what currently. And again, I think we become town blind, we become signage blind. I drove into a town the other week going in a New South Wales town, and there was a tree growing in front of their town entrance statement. Now, that tree didn't just happen last week, it's been there for a year, but people drive past every day. I drove into a town and it had a sign up saying, "We don't have a hospital, but we do have a good cemetery," type thing. And again, it was a play on, it was a driver education, but again, not the smart stuff. And then the state of often main streets and buildings and whatever.
I like the town signs that say, winner of the Tidy Towns, 1998. You think,
and again, I'm a great fan of Tidy Towns. I'm actually a Tidy Town volunteer judge.
Yeah. No, nothing against them, but just the dated nature.
But, the first thing I say, and I show people, I'm working in one town, I won't quote it currently, they've got signs up from 5 years ago. I can remember Dorrigo, which is one of the most incredible towns we've got in terms of stunning with its rail heritage, its beauty. But again, advertising stuff from 20 to 30 years ago is that, people couldn't give us stuff that you were a Tidy Towns winner back in 1998. What people want to know is what's happening now. I have got into trouble by calling one town, it was 25 years ago, I at a conference got sucked in by a young journalist to label what I thought of certain towns, and I mentioned one called Donnybrook as probably the ugliest town I know in the country in the southwest of Wales. That really upset the locals. But
I
boy,
bet.
did it activate. You drive through Donnybrook today, it is stunning what they've done. But you know what? This is where the Granny Smith in WA comes from. This is where gold was first discovered. This is where Donnybrook stone comes from. This is the entrance to one of the most beautiful kind of like pathways into the southwest, and yet the main street and entrance statements. But go there today, amazing. Look at that amazing playground they've built. That's a pretty smart, but again, the location, main street, near businesses. But there was a group, and they realised what they'd got was, believe it or not, an advantage. They started printing T-shirts. If you think I'm ugly, you should see Donnybrook. They also printed one that said, if you think Donnybrook's ugly, you should see Peter Kenyon. But I thought that was getting a bit overboard in text. But from that, and through the leadership of particularly their Chamber of Commerce, that town just used the words of, I think I thought I had probably had too much red wine when I made that comment. So taking the words of a drunk, they really did something amazing. But I do believe that many of our small towns do not put on their best face. And really, it doesn't take a lot of effort to give attention to signage, to give attention to what your main streets are the barometer of pride and confidence of any town. And what we've got to do is get people stopping. We don't want people just driving through. We don't want people just stopping your town boundary, use the toilet. We want people stopping, getting out of their cars and putting their hands in their pockets and spending on local products and services. And that's why appearance. And boy, we've got some amazing towns that have done wonderful signage, the way people use humour, the way people use greenery, flowers. I love going to France. They have an annual contest called the 10 Most Beautiful Villages of France. Well, if you look at what wins it, it's always flowers, greenery, attraction, just amazing to walk around these towns that are labelled the best villages of France. And again, it's physical stuff that really is so important in it. But then the other factors I mentioned earlier about definitely leadership and mindset are just so important, and community engagement. This is not a silo job. We need a full team effort. And so being creative about how we get our community engaged, not just in ideas, but in making ideas reality, is so important in the whole thing.
Absolutely. In a majority of small towns needing renewal, it's the women who seem to take on the leadership challenges. What do you put that down to, Peter?
We all have our theories on that, and I might be in trouble with mine, but, I tend to think partly it's our socialisation. I think women take on multiple roles. They balance more balls in the air than often men and so on. Many of the young women I work with in our small towns, they're a partner in a farm. They're also the primary kind of like giver to the kids, involved with the kids' school. They're the ones that are on the local P&C committee. They're the ones who are, aware of the future that they want to often create. And so I think, women are much more multi-skilled. But I think there's another thing, and I've mentioned it a few times. One of the challenges of small towns is what I call risk aversion. And I think men are much more in small towns risk aversive. I'm generalising, and there are lots of amazing exceptions to that. And my two towns of Noangarup and Coolin, I mentioned, there were some amazing men driving some of that stuff. But generally, if I'm running a workshop with community builders in town, I can almost guarantee 90% of people in the room are going to be women. And to me, the critical group in any town is that 28 to 45 age group. This is the group who are buying houses, having babies. They are coaches and mentors of our sport. And let's be honest, well over 80% of our businesses are started by that particular age group. So that's a critical group. And particularly when I'm asked to come in and do a community plan for a town, I'll often spend 3 or 4 days in the town. The very first meeting, I always say, organise a meeting with the playgroup mums. I'll bring the cake and coffee. We can do it while the kids are creating chaos in their area, but I need to listen to them. And then again, how do I get to talk to your partners and your husbands and whatever? And recently I did work out at Quirriting, amazing other town, about an hour and a half out of Perth. The best 2 meetings we had was firstly with the playgroup, and they got me well and truly sorted on the town and directed, and then meeting with farmers out for what we call beer chat and burger nights out at the fire stations out of town, and after footy training on the Thursday night. Those meetings were sensational. Again, that was the advice of those young women in the town about how best to kind of like connect and whatever. So again, I've got my theories on it, and I'm only going on past experience where over 90% of the community builder people I'm working with happen to be women. And I think there are reasons why they take that risk and why they care deeply. And it's often because of the multiple roles, and particularly interaction with their children is pretty vital.
Perhaps to finish off, you've got another Small Towns Conference coming up.
And I'd love to mention that this will be the third National Small Town Reinvention Conference. And the first one was in my little hometown of Pickering Brook. The second was in Kapunda, as you mentioned. And the third will be based out in Longreach. But the exciting thing about how we run conferences, I'm one of those people who hate going to conferences, I'll let you know, because it's a lot of sit and listen. What I much prefer is get onto a bus and let's go out and look at things. Let's go out and interact with people. And so we'll be doing trips up to Winton, and I'm hoping that, David there at Designer World will be able to just tell us his story and what made it happen, what he sees. He's a real small towns advocate and then to go into Winton and to have a look at those town entrance statements. And then we're planning, to have the wonderful pub in Ilfracombe there, the Well Shot Pub. We'll have an evening there with Tracy Hatch, the publican, and her story and how she sees rural stuff. And then we're going to go out to Aramac with an amazing trail of public art sculptures done by one woman who just had a dream of what you could create in Outback there, and the other stuff that they're doing there in Aramac. But we're also going to go down to Blackhall and hear the story of Tambo and Barcaldine and Iceford. So it's going to be one of those conferences. Yes, we'll have some of the presentations because people want it. Yes, we will have some master classes on skills and tools so people can really equip themselves. But also it's going to be one of those conferences where we'll just get out and see amazing things happening in that western part of Queensland. It's going to be in the second week of September, from about the 6th of September this year. So please, anyone listening, put that in your diary. I know it's a long way to get, but I can tell you, it's worth going to see that part of rural, but also to have and spend with at least another 100 people who care about small town Australia from across Australia. I've already got one shire. They're already planning to caravan across there and bring a whole pile of people from their town. So that's from Western Australia, from the little town of Westonia, are already locked in terms of it. So again, it'll be a unique experience to just be with people who care and have stories and lessons and some amazing examples of what they're doing to make a small town happen.
And I guess people can find out all about that on your website, bankofideas.com.au.
Thank you for the plug.
I know one of my colleagues who might already be angling to try and get there.
We will always make sure that Outback's there. That's a given. You've got the best magazine, rural magazine, I tell anyone on the planet, not just in Australia.
Oh, thank you.
I only lack edition 1. That's part of my dream as a collector, is to find that number 1, but I've got every other edition, and I tell you, it's a constant source of inspiration.
Perhaps finally, Peter, if I can ask you what you think the biggest issues currently facing small towns in Australia are right now.
Well, I could just list, small towns face challenge after challenge after challenge. For some of them, it's as simple as they don't offer good cake, good coffee, and good conversation.
The 3 C's.
If you're not able to give a decent cup of coffee, you're not going to really be a destination for people coming and also people living. That I always say that's a good place to start. Do you offer good cake? good coffee, and good conversation, meaning good bumping spaces. Secondly, obviously, COVID was able to do in 8 months, which I'd been struggling to do for 30 years, and that is to get people to move out there. And we've seen a massive movement of people out there where still 1 in 3 people are able to work either full-time or part-time from home. Why not do it in a stunning little village where people care and your next-door neighbours will talk to you? But again, we've seen a lot of young families move out, and issues to do with housing and childcare have become phenomenal. And again, one of the things I'm excited about spending time back in Canada, they particularly using the cooperative to create childcare co-ops throughout the prairies, and really keen to learn about how they're doing that, because that's a really critical issue. There's obviously always issues about being more than a dot on the map, and that's about our appearance, that's about what we're offering to people in terms of lifestyle, and the identity that we're trying to market to people and the events we offer. So there's all of that. And then I think, people obviously, again, that whole issue of wanting to stay within these communities as we age. And what I'm excited is the staying in place initiatives that I'm aware now over 130 small towns driven by Bell in Queensland and Pingelly in Western Australia have shown you can actually create an internal local system where people do not need to move to the city or the coast to retire, but can actually do it. And so that staying in place challenge is another one that we need to look at. And finally, all towns need to be constantly alert to economic and to employment opportunities. We need in all of our towns an ecosystem that supports people with ideas, whether it be a person, whether it be a group, but somewhere where people who come into these towns all bring ideas. How do we have people in these towns connect as brokers to link them to available workspace, to people who can help them with marketing, to help them link into what kind of schemes of support might be available? That's a challenge, is how we keep diversifying the business and employment base of our towns. So that's just a few. And we've, got problems with all of our politicians being city-centric. That's always a problem. We've got a whole pile of things related to the fact that we are a small minority within this country, with over 80% of our population living within 100 kilometres of the coast and in our, 6 to 8 big cities. They're all the challenges there, but you know what? I want to finish by saying every one of our towns is asset rich in terms of people and in terms of opportunity. And the starting point always is not to look at what we need. We'll never know what we need until we first know what we've got. And I always say start with that and begin with that. That will give energy, that will give motivation. Above all, it'll give starting points in terms of where we can go, in terms of dealing with, and I don't want to underestimate the massive issues we face in being in rural and remote Australia.
So thank you so much for your time today, and all the best for your continued really important work for rural and regional Australia. You can read more about Peter and small towns generally in Ken's story, which, as I said earlier, is in issue 166 of Outback magazine. I'm sure we haven't heard the last of you in Outback, Peter.
Well, thank you, Terry, and thank you for the great job you and Outback do. As I said earlier, I'm a huge fan of Outback magazine. I love it. I love using it as part of my resources to go in. But I love the work that you people do, and I love the way you write. I love the way that you highlight heroes and you highlight people making a difference. You highlight the quirky stuff. And to me, there's no magazine on this planet, and I say that always to everyone, like Outback. They must subscribe to Outback. So thank you for that. And I just love what you continue to do with that magazine, but also podcasts like this, which again is all part of that communication journey that you've created for rural and remote Australia, and the fact that you particularly focus on the remote and on small town kind of like, so to me, that's a huge joy. I can hardly wait when I go to the letterbox to see the latest edition. And I'm very much a hard copy boy. I love having a magazine in my hands. It's just, to me, is the real joy. And I just want to thank you, Ken, and your editor and the staff and the owners of it to say, look, it matters to rural Australia like no other communication medium we've got. So thank you.
Well, I think we'll just clip this bit out and use it as an ad.
And it's said very honestly. I'm not, as we say out there in rural Australia, I'm not pissing in your pocket. I'm saying it because I believe this is the truth.
Well, you did mention numerous times during this talk that important word story, and the stories are very powerful. And so much of the media is, of course, focused on the cities. So it is important that we tell the stories of rural, remote, regional. Absolutely. We'll keep doing it for as long as we can.
You do. And I said just this morning when I was speaking with my friends in Canada and we're talking about the workshops, we need workshops that focus on stories. You can tell people facts and figures, they won't often remember it. Tell people theory, they'll never remember it. Tell people a good story, they never forget it. And I say to everyone, you want to make a difference, be a storyteller. It's the most important job in the world. And that's what Outback does for us. You're great storytellers. Thank you.
Well, it was great hearing about your story today, Peter.
Well, thank you, Terry. You go well.
Thank you. There's so much to think about in that episode. Talking to Peter certainly made me think about the town I live in and what we could be doing better. As I said, Peter features in issue 166 of Outback in a story by Ken Eastwood, where Ken talks to many different people about the small towns of Australia. For more information about Outback, go to outbackmag.com.au. The R.M.Williams Outback podcast is hosted and produced by me, Terry Cowley. Editor-in-Chief is Mark Muller. Original theme music by Isaac May.